My name is Leon Griffin. I'm 38 years old. For most of my adult life, I've been the kind of man people describe as steady. I live in a quiet suburb outside the city, work in data compliance for a mid-sized firm, and keep my routines predictable. I'm not loud. I'm not charismatic in a room full of people. I don't dominate conversations. If you met me at a neighborhood barbecue, you'd probably think I was polite, maybe even a little reserved. The kind of person who listens more than he talks. The kind of person who avoids conflict. And for a long time, that's exactly how I was seen. But what people often mistake for passivity is observation. What they call quiet is sometimes restraint. And what looks like weakness can, under the right pressure, become something far more deliberate. This story isn't about revenge. It isn't about humiliation. And it isn't about destroying someone who hurt me. It's about what happens when a narrative spreads faster than the truth. It's about what it feels like to sit in silence while the world believes a version of you that you don't recognize. And it's about the day the courtroom heard the truth straight from our living room. When she told everyone I was abusive, I didn't yell. I didn't chase her around town defending myself. I didn't launch social media counterattacks or beg mutual friends to take my side. I did something else, something slower, something quieter. I unlocked the hidden audio recordings, not because I planned to use them from the beginning, not because I was building a trap, but because somewhere along the way, I realized that being unheard doesn't mean you're powerless. It just means you have to choose when you speak and how. This story will take you through the slow unraveling of a marriage, the subtle shifts that most people never notice, the way small accusations can snowball into a reputation you never earned. It will also take you inside my head not as a hero, not as a victim, but as a man trying to hold on to his dignity when the ground beneath him starts to move. There were moments when I questioned myself. Moments when I wondered if maybe I really was the villain in someone else's story. And there were nights when silence felt heavier than any argument ever could. But truth has a weight of its own. And eventually, it surfaces. This isn't a story about destroying someone who lied. It's about surviving when the lie almost destroys you. If you've ever had your character questioned, if you've ever felt your reputation slipping through your fingers while you stood there speechless, you'll understand what this journey cost. Tell me something, have you ever watched people believe a version of you that you knew wasn't real? Before I was abusive, before I became a whisper passed between mutual friends, before my name felt heavy in rooms I wasn't even in, I was predictable, dependable, harmless. That's the word I heard most often. Harmless. At work in Manchester, I was the man who stayed late to double-check compliance reports no one else wanted to review. I didn't argue in meetings. I didn't interrupt. When tensions rose, I'd lean back, let the louder voices burn themselves out, and then quietly summarize what had actually been said. People trusted me with details, not with emotions, in social settings. I was background stability. I carried chairs. I refilled drinks. I drove when others had too much wine. I remembered birthdays. I remembered allergies. I remembered small things because that's how I showed care. And at home, in our living room, the one with the pale grey sofa and the long window facing the street, I was the same man, structured, measured, calm. She used to tell people I was emotionally reserved. Sometimes she said it affectionately. Other times, it sounded like an accusation wrapped in humour. Leon doesn't really do big feelings. She'd laugh. Everyone would smile. I'd smile too, because I understood how I looked from the outside. I wasn't theatrical. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't storm out of rooms. My disagreements came in sentences like, "I see it differently," instead of, "You're wrong." And in a world that equates volume with sincerity, that can look suspicious. But here's what they didn't see: restraint takes effort. Holding a room steady when tension rises takes effort. Choosing not to escalate takes effort. Silence, when used intentionally, is not absence. It's discipline. Still, over time, I noticed a subtle shift in how I was framed in conversations. If something went wrong, a late payment, a forgotten errand, a missed call, the assumption often tilted toward me. Not because I was reckless, but because I was unlikely to defend myself dramatically. I would correct gently, clarify, provide context, but I wouldn't fight. And in the early days of our marriage, that difference didn't matter. We were balanced. She was expressive, charismatic, and socially magnetic. I was grounded, practical, structured. People often said we complemented each other. She brings you out of your shell. You calm her down. It sounded healthy. It felt healthy. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, I began to notice that our dynamic had an audience. And the audience preferred a simpler storyline. She was vibrant. I was cold. She was emotional. I was detached. She was reactive. I was calculating. That last word slipped into conversations once. Calculating. It was said jokingly, but it lingered. I remember standing in our kitchen after one dinner party, rinsing glasses, hearing her recount a disagreement we'd had earlier that week. She described my tone as intimidating. I had spoken quietly, measured, but in her retelling, the quiet became menacing. Everyone laughed uncomfortably. I didn't correct her, because correcting your spouse publicly over something that's small feels petty, and because I truly believed that intent mattered more than perception. I never imagined perception would one day become the only thing that mattered. Back then, I was still operating under the assumption that truth naturally balances itself. If you live consistently enough, your character speaks for you. I didn't realize that a character without a narrative is vulnerable. To them, I was stable, predictable, emotionally distant, perhaps, but safe. At least, that's what I thought. I had no idea how quickly quiet could be rewritten as controlling, and I certainly didn't know that one day, the same living room where I washed glasses and listened politely would become the center of a very different story, one that painted me in a way I didn't recognize at all. Looking back, the first cut wasn't dramatic. There was no slamming door, no shattered glass, no shouting echoed through the hallway. It was smaller than that, quieter, almost forgettable, which is exactly why it mattered. It happened on a Thursday evening. I remember because Thursdays were my late days at the office. I'd stayed behind to finalize a compliance audit, then stopped at the grocery store on the way home. When I walked into the house, the living room lights were already on, warm against the early Manchester dusk. She was on the phone. I heard my name before I stepped fully into the room, and he just stood there, staring at me. She was saying, it was honestly intimidating. I paused in the hallway, not eavesdropping, just registering. Her voice carried a tone I didn't recognize. It wasn't playful exaggeration. It wasn't affectionate teasing. It sounded serious. I stepped in, set the grocery bags on the counter, and she looked at me briefly, just a flicker before turning slightly away. Yeah, she continued. Sometimes he doesn't even have to raise his voice. It's the silence that's worse. Silence, worse. The conversation ended a few minutes later. She hung up, smiled at me as if nothing had happened, and asked what I'd bought for dinner. I didn't confront her. Not because I was afraid, but because I assumed context would clarify everything. Maybe she'd been venting. Maybe she'd dramatized it to feel heard. Still, something about the phrasing stayed with me. He just stood there. It was intimidating. I replayed the argument she'd referenced. It had been about finances, a routine discussion about discretionary spending. I had said, calmly, that we needed to stick closer to our monthly budget. She had grown frustrated. I had remained steady. There had been no raised voice, no threat, no insult. I remember leaning against the kitchen counter during that argument, hands relaxed, listening more than speaking. And now that moment had been reframed as something menacing. That night, as we ate dinner, I asked lightly, did I really come across as intimidating the other day? She shrugged. You don't realize how intense you can be. Intense. Another word added to the collection. I asked what she meant. She struggled to define it. It's just your energy. You go quiet, and it feels heavy. Heavy, I nodded. I told her I'd think about it. And I meant that. Because here's the thing, when someone you love tells you that your presence feels threatening, you don't dismiss it outright. You examine yourself. That's what I did. Over the next week, I monitored my tone more carefully, softened my posture during disagreements, added extra verbal reassurance. I'm not angry. I'm just explaining. I'm not upset with you. It felt unnatural, narrating my emotional state like that. But I did it anyway. And yet, 2 weeks later at a friend's dinner, I heard it again. Oh, Leon doesn't have to shout, she said with a half smile. He can freeze a room just by looking at you. Laughter, not malicious, not cruel, but uneasy. I smiled along. Because what else do you do? Correct your wife in front of friends and confirm the narrative. That was the first small cut. Not an accusation of abuse, not yet. Just the planting of an idea. That my calm was something darker. That my restraint was a form of control. And what unsettled me most wasn't that she said it. It was that no one questioned it. Not one person asked for context. The seed didn't need evidence. It only needed repetition. And I was beginning to understand something dangerous when someone frames your personality as a flaw, and you respond quietly. Your silence can start to look like confirmation. I didn't know then how far that seed would grow, but I remember the exact moment I realized something subtle had shifted not in our marriage, but in how I was being described to the world. And once a description changes, reality has a way of bending around it. The strange thing about subtle disrespect is that it doesn't announce itself. It blends in. It arrives disguised as humor, concern, or just being honest. And because it doesn't bruise the skin, you convince yourself it hasn't really hurt. After that first small cut, the language didn't escalate overnight. It accumulated. A comment here, a tone there. If I disagreed with her in front of friends, she'd tilt her head and say, "See, this is what I mean." What did she mean? That I was rigid? That I was emotionally closed off? That my silence was strategic? Strategic. It was said lightly, but it carried weight. I began noticing how often I was described instead of understood. She would narrate my personality to others as if she were translating a foreign language. Leon processes things internally. Leon doesn't like being challenged. Leon can be very controlling about routines. Controlling routines. I wake up at the same time each day. I track expenses. I schedule reminders. I believe in consistency. That was my definition of stability. Somehow, in the retelling, it became something sharper. At first, I rationalized it. She's expressive. She exaggerates. It's her way of venting. And I told myself something else if I reacted strongly to these small characterizations. I'd prove her point, so I stayed measured. When she joked about me being emotionally unavailable, I'd respond gently, "I'm right here." When she told her sister that I hated confrontation, I corrected quietly, "I don't hate it, I just don't escalate it." But repetition does something powerful. Over time, people stopped looking to me for clarification. They started looking at me for confirmation. At gatherings, if a disagreement surfaced, I could feel eyes flick toward me as if waiting for the intimidating silence to appear. And here's what unsettled me most once you know you're being observed through a distorted lens. Your natural behavior changes. I became hyper-aware of my posture, of the length of my pauses, the way my jaw tightened when thinking. I was no longer just existing. I was managing perception, and perception is exhausting. At home, small disagreements began carrying a new undertone. If I stood firm on something finances, scheduling, even household chores, she'd sigh and say, "You always have to win." I wasn't trying to win, I was trying to resolve. But the narrative had shifted. Resolution became dominance. Consistency became rigidity. Calm became intimidation. And because none of it was explosive, none of it felt urgent enough to confront directly. There was no singular moment I could point to and say, "That's unfair." It was a slow erosion, 1,000 paper cuts. The most dangerous part, I started questioning myself. Maybe I do come across colder than I realize. Maybe my silence does feel heavy. Maybe I should talk more, smile more, soften more. So I tried. I initiated check-ins. I asked how she felt. I verbalized affection more explicitly. But the more I adjusted, the more the label seemed to stick. It was like trying to outrun a shadow. And gradually, something else happened, a subtle shift in tone during private arguments. "You don't even realize how you sound," she said once, eyes narrowed. "It's scary sometimes. Scary." That word didn't feel like humor. It felt like positioning. And for the first time, a quiet thought surfaced that I immediately tried to suppress. What if this isn't accidental? What if this is intentional framing? I didn't let that thought stay long. It felt paranoid, unfair. So I did what I had always done. I rationalized. Because accepting that someone you love might be slowly reshaping how the world sees you, that's far more frightening than being misunderstood by strangers. Still, I couldn't ignore the pattern anymore. Disrespect had become normalized. Not loud, not violent, just consistent enough to reshape perception. And I was beginning to understand that once a label attaches to you, removing it requires more than calm explanations. It requires something stronger than words. There's a moment in every long relationship when you realize you're no longer just being yourself. You're performing a version of yourself that someone else expects. I didn't notice when it happened, but one evening, sitting across from her at our dining table, listening to her recount our dynamic to a friend on speakerphone, I heard it clearly. I just have to manage him sometimes. She said, he shuts down if things don't go his way. Manage him. I looked up slowly. She didn't look at me. That was the role. Not a partner, not equal, something to manage. Over the following months, the pattern sharpened. If I remained calm during an argument, it was described as emotional withdrawal. If I spoke firmly, it was described as controlling. If I asked for accountability, it became pressure. There was no correct version of me, only the one that confirmed the narrative. At social gatherings, I began to feel like a character introduced before I spoke. This is Leon, she'd say, smiling. He's very particular. Particular. People would laugh gently, as if I were a charming eccentricity. But I could see it in their eyes, a prejudgment forming before I opened my mouth. Reliable, structured, difficult, and the most dangerous one of all, intimidating. It's strange how subtle conditioning works. When someone describes you often enough in a certain way, others begin to filter your behavior through that description. If I paused before responding, it was calculating. If I chose not to engage, it was passive-aggressive. If I stood my ground, it was controlling. I started noticing something even more unsettling. She began positioning herself as the emotionally burdened one. I'm always walking on eggshells, she told her sister once. Not quietly enough. Eggshells. I replayed our recent weeks in my mind, searching for volatility, for raised voices, for slammed doors. There were none, but the role had been assigned, and roles, once accepted by an audience, become difficult to break. In private, she would sometimes test the boundaries of that role. During disagreements, she'd raise her voice slightly, then lower it dramatically and say, "See, I can't even talk freely." The implication hung heavy in the air, that my presence alone restricted her. It was subtle, masterful, even, how do you defend yourself against an accusation that has no concrete event attached to it? I feel uncomfortable. You don't realize how intense you are. You make things heavy. Feelings are real, but they aren't always accurate reflections of reality. Still, I didn't attack her feelings. I validated them. I asked what I could do differently, and that's when I understood the trap. Every attempt to clarify became evidence of defensiveness. Every attempt to adjust became proof that there was something to fix. The role wasn't accidental. It was stabilizing for her. If she was overwhelmed, I was oppressive. If she was emotional, I was cold. If she was reactive, I was controlling. The contrast made sense. It was clean, simple, believable. And I, with my calm demeanor and measured tone, fit perfectly into the outline of a man who doesn't need to shout to be scary. I began to withdraw socially, not out of anger, but exhaustion. It's tiring to walk into rooms knowing you're pre-labeled. The reliable one, the rigid one, the emotionally distant one, the potential abuser hidden beneath politeness. I never imagined that word would one day be said explicitly, but I could feel its silhouette forming, and for the first time, a quiet awareness settled in my chest. If the role continued solidifying like this, if perception kept bending further from the truth, one day, my silence wouldn't just look suspicious. It would look guilty. The shift didn't happen during an argument. It didn't happen during a dramatic accusation or a slammed door. It happened on an ordinary Sunday morning. Rain pressed softly against the windows. The house was quiet except for the low hum of the boiler. I was in the living room, seated at the edge of the grey sofa, reviewing our monthly expenses on my laptop. She was in the kitchen, moving cabinets a little louder than necessary. We hadn't argued the night before. There was no tension in the air that I could name, but something felt staged. She walked into the living room holding her phone, not looking at me, not speaking to me, just holding it loosely at chest level. The screen was dark, but angled outward. She sighed. Not a natural sigh, a deliberate one. Then she said, "I can't keep feeling like this." I looked up calmly, feeling like what? She didn't answer immediately. She adjusted her grip on the phone. That's when I noticed the faint reflection in the screen it was recording. My chest didn't tighten. My pulse didn't spike. Instead, something inside me became very still. It was the kind of stillness you feel when you suddenly understand a pattern you've been subconsciously assembling for months. This wasn't a spontaneous emotional release. This was documentation. "I feel controlled," she continued. voice steady but charged, like I can't even breathe without being evaluated. I close my laptop slowly. Not dramatically, just carefully. I could have reacted defensively. I could have said, "That's ridiculous." I could have asked why she was recording, but I didn't, because in that moment, I understood something with unsettling clarity. This conversation wasn't about resolution. It was about evidence, not evidence of what happened, evidence of how I might respond. So I did what I had always done. I spoke evenly. "I don't want you to feel controlled." I said, "If something I'm doing feels that way, I want to understand it." She blinked, as if recalibrating. "You always say that." She replied, "You make it sound reasonable, but it never changes." I studied her face. There was frustration there. Real frustration. But beneath it was something else, expectation. As if she were waiting for me to crack, to raise my voice, to lose composure, to validate the narrative that had been quietly building. I didn't. Instead, I asked, "What specifically feels controlling?" She hesitated. "Just the way you look at me when I spend money. The way you go quiet. The way you look at me." That phrase echoed. I've always had a steady gaze. I listen without interrupting. I don't fill silence with nervous chatter. Suddenly, that was evidence. The room felt smaller. Not physically, conceptually. And that's when the shift happened. Not anger, not panic. Awareness. I realized I was no longer just in a relationship conflict. I was in a narrative construction. And if she was recording selectively, if she was capturing fragments without context, then someday, those fragments could be replayed without the quiet stability that surrounded them. I looked at her phone again. She didn't lower it. Something inside me recalibrated permanently. Not toward retaliation, not toward aggression, toward documentation. I had always been meticulous at work. Every compliance meeting is recorded. Every audit trail is preserved. Every conversation is summarized in writing. At home, I had relied on trust. That morning, trust shifted into something more structured. After she left the room, I sat there for a long time, listening to the rain, listening to the silence. And for the first time, I asked myself a question I had avoided for months. If a story about me is being built, shouldn't I at least make sure the full truth exists somewhere? That was the day something changed. Not in her, in me. I stopped trying to correct perception in real time. I started preparing quietly for the possibility that one day, correction would require more than words. After that Sunday morning, my silence changed. Before, it had been instinctive, a personality trait, the way I processed information and conflict. Now, it has become intentional, deliberate, strategic. I didn't confront her about the recording. I didn't accuse her of building a case. I didn't alter my tone dramatically or begin overperforming calmness. I simply became aware. Awareness sharpens everything. When she raised her voice slightly during disagreements, I noticed the timing. When she softened her tone suddenly, I noticed the glance toward her phone. When conversations escalated only in private but were summarized differently in public, I noticed the pattern. But I didn't react, because reacting would feed the frame. Instead, I refined something I had always possessed: control over my own responses. Not suppression, control. There's a difference. Suppression is emotional pressure building under a lid. Control is emotional clarity without leakage. I chose the second. And almost immediately, something interesting happened. She mistook it for weakness. "You don't even fight for yourself," she said one evening after I declined to engage in a circular argument. "That's what's so frustrating. Fight for myself." The irony wasn't lost on me. For months, I had been carefully defending myself in subtle ways, adjusting tone, offering reassurance, seeking resolution. But now that I stopped over-explaining, my composure looked like surrender. It wasn't surrender. It was data collection. At work, I had access to a small brushed steel digital recorder, the one I used during compliance interviews to ensure accuracy. I had always believed in documentation as protection, not as a weapon. For the first time, I brought that mindset home. I didn't record constantly. I didn't create traps. I didn't provoke. But during tense conversations, the kind where tone could later be distorted, I ensured that context existed somewhere outside memory. Not to use, just to preserve. There's something grounding about knowing that truth is stored intact. It reduces the temptation to argue in the moment. It removes the panic of being misquoted later, and my calm deepened, which unsettled her. "You're so detached lately," she said one night. It's like you don't even care. I cared. Deeply. But I also understood something now. When someone expects you to explode, composure becomes threatening. When someone expects you to defend yourself emotionally, restraint feels like resistance. And when someone is building a narrative that relies on your volatility, stability becomes inconvenient. I watched subtle frustration build in her reactions. She pushed harder in small ways, sharper phrasing, more public commentary about my intensity. But without escalation from me, the contrast weakened. Friends who had once looked at me cautiously began hesitating before laughing at her characterizations. The jokes didn't land the same way without visible proof. Still, I didn't correct her publicly. Not yet. Because silence had become something else now. Not absence, not fear, preparation. I started keeping written summaries of major disagreements, dates, context, neutral descriptions, not accusations, just facts. If she said I had raised my voice, I checked my memory against the recording. If she said I had cornered her, I replayed the spatial reality of the room. Consistency. That's what I was tracking. Not to win, but to ensure that if the day ever came when my character was questioned formally, not socially, not casually, but legally, I wouldn't be relying on recollection alone. I never imagined it would reach that level, but something inside me had shifted from reactive husband to quiet archivist of truth. And the more composed I became, the more impatient she seemed. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but I could feel it. Silence, once a personality trait, had become a choice, and she no longer knew how to interpret it. From the outside, nothing changed. We still attended dinners, still posted occasional holiday photos, still appeared coordinated, the calm husband and the expressive wife. If anything, I seemed quieter, more subdued, less reactive. No one knew that beneath that stillness, I was building a structure. Not revenge, structure. At work, documentation was second nature to me. Every compliance review required timestamps, archived communications, and contextual notes. I had spent over a decade understanding one core principle: memory is unreliable under pressure. Records are not. I began applying that principle gently at home, not obsessively. Not obsessively enough to feel paranoid, just consistently. If we had a disagreement about finances, I saved the spreadsheet with visible timestamps. If she claimed I had forbidden a purchase, I archived the email where I had written, "I think we should revisit this next month." If she said I had refused to let her see friends, I kept calendar records showing the opposite. It wasn't dramatic, it was boring, and boring is powerful. Because truth, when preserved in mundane detail, becomes difficult to distort. The audio recordings were part of that, but not in the way people might imagine. I didn't hide devices around the house. I didn't engineer confrontations. I simply ensured that when a conversation escalated in tone or accusation, context existed somewhere outside interpretation. Most of the recordings were uneventful. Calm discussions, me asking questions, her expressing frustration. No shouting, no threats, no raised voice from me. And that's what unsettled me most, because I began to see the divergence clearly. The private reality was measured. The public summary was volatile. One evening, I overheard her telling a friend that she felt unsafe during arguments. Unsafe. I replayed the most recent argument in my head. It had been about a utility bill. I had spoken quietly. She had raised her voice briefly. I had asked, "Can we lower the volume and focus on the numbers?" Unsafe. That word doesn't float casually in the air. It anchors. It signals something serious. And in that moment, I understood the trajectory. The narrative was escalating, not from controlling, not from intense, toward abusive. The difference between those words isn't semantic. It's legal. It's reputational. It's life-altering. That realization didn't make me angry. It made me precise. I consulted a solicitor discreetly not to file anything, not to initiate separation, but to understand risk. I described hypothetical scenarios, asked about evidentiary standards, asked what constituted coercive control legally in the UK. I never used her name. The solicitor's advice was simple: documentation matters, tone matters, patterns matter. I left that meeting with no dramatic plan, just clarity. At home, I adjusted nothing externally. I didn't withdraw affection. I didn't confront her about the words unsafe or abusive, even when I sensed them forming. Instead, I focused on consistency. If she claimed I isolated her, I encouraged social outings. If she said I controlled finances, I offered joint reviews. If she implied emotional neglect, I scheduled counseling, which she declined, citing discomfort. Each offer was documented neutrally. What they never noticed, friends, family, even she herself, was that the quiet man in the corner wasn't shrinking. He was archiving, not because he wanted to destroy someone, but because he was beginning to understand that when a narrative becomes powerful enough, truth must be stored somewhere durable and deep down. Beneath the calm, a single thought had solidified. If the accusation ever becomes formal, if the word abusive is ever spoken in a place that matters, I will not rely on memory, I will rely on reality. And reality, unlike rumor, can be replayed, slowly, clearly, without distortion. They never noticed the preparation. They only saw the quiet, and they mistook it for defeat. The word finally left her mouth on a Tuesday night. Not whispered, not implied, spoken. You're emotionally abusive. There was no audience, no friends, no family. Just the two of us standing in the living room, the same room where so many ordinary evenings had unfolded without incident. She didn't scream it. She said it steadily, like a conclusion she had rehearsed privately before deciding it was ready for daylight. For a moment, the room felt weightless, not tense, not explosive, just suspended. I didn't argue. I didn't demand evidence. I simply asked, "What specifically have I done that feels abusive?" She blinked, looked away, then said, "It's the pattern, the pressure, the way you make me doubt myself." The pattern? That word again. But here's the thing about patterns: they can be examined. After she went upstairs, I remained seated on the sofa. I didn't feel rage. I didn't feel vindication. I felt something far more sobering. Confirmation. The trajectory I had sensed months ago had arrived exactly where it was heading. And for the first time, I allowed myself to do something I had resisted. I listened. Not to her, to the recordings, one by one. I sat in the dim light of the living room and replayed the past several months of difficult conversations. I didn't cherry-pick. I didn't search for moments that made her look unreasonable. I listened as if I were a third party, a judge without context. What I heard wasn't perfection. I heard tension, frustration, disagreements, moments where my tone was firm, moments where hers was sharp. But I did not hear threats. I did not hear manipulation. I did not hear control. I heard two adults disagreeing, one consistently calm, one increasingly reactive. And in some recordings, I heard something else. Silence after she accused me of something extreme, followed by my voice asking for specifics, followed by vagueness. The realization wasn't triumphant. It was clarifying, because now I knew something with certainty. If the accusation ever moved beyond our walls, if it ever left the living room and entered a formal space, the truth would not depend on interpretation. It would exist. Recorded, time-stamped, contextual. That knowledge didn't make me feel powerful. It made me feel calm, not because I wanted to use it, but because I finally understood that I wasn't losing my grip on reality. Gaslighting is subtle. It doesn't shout. It suggests. It reframes. It makes you question your own tone, your own memory, your own posture. For months, I had been wondering if perhaps I truly was unknowingly harmful. The recordings answered that quietly. No, you are firm. You are measured. You are direct. But you are not abusive. That private reveal, not to anyone else, but to myself, changed everything. Because once you stop doubting your own reality, you stop negotiating with false versions of yourself. The next morning, I treated her the same way I always had. No coldness, no distance, no confrontation about the words she had used. But internally, something irreversible had settled. If this continued, if the narrative escalated, I would not defend myself emotionally. I would defend myself factually. And fact has a way of sounding very different when played back in full. The courtroom had not yet entered the picture, but for the first time, I understood that if it ever did, the truth was already waiting, quietly, on record. The accusation didn't end our marriage overnight. It settled into it. After she called me emotionally abusive, the word began appearing more casually. Not in every conversation, not screamed during arguments, just referenced. You see how that sounds? Right, that's what I mean. This is exactly the kind of thing I'm talking about. Abusive didn't need to be repeated constantly. It hovered in the background like a silent caption. And then one evening, she said something that shifted everything from internal preparation to external risk. "If I ever told people what it's really like," she said quietly, "they'd understand." There it was. Not a threat, not explicitly, but a signal. Narrative escalation was no longer hypothetical. It was being considered as leverage. That night, after she fell asleep, I sat alone at the dining table with 3 options in front of me. The first option was confrontation. Lay everything out. Tell her I knew about the framing. Tell her I had recordings. Demand counseling. Force transparency. It would have felt satisfying in the moment, but it would also expose my preparation and potentially provoke exactly the kind of emotional reaction that could be reframed later. The second option was endurance. Stay. Continue documenting. Hope the narrative faded. Hope time softened it. But hope is not a strategy. And endurance without boundaries eventually becomes permission. The third option was irreversible. Legal separation. Not dramatic. Not explosive. Quiet. Formal. Structured. It would change everything. Finances. Living arrangements. Social perception. It would confirm to outsiders that something serious had happened. And once you begin that process, you don't casually undo it. I stared at the brushed steel recorder on the table. It looked small, ordinary. Inside it was context. Proof not of her wrongdoing but of my composure, of my consistency, of the absence of abuse. If I stayed and the narrative escalated publicly, I might find myself defending against allegations instead of simply ending a marriage. If I left quietly now, while the truth was intact and archived, I controlled the timing. That was the real leverage, not humiliation. Timing. The next morning, I called the solicitor again. This time, not hypothetically. I asked about formal steps, about documentation standards, about how accusations of emotional abuse are assessed during divorce proceedings in the UK. The advice was measured: proceed calmly, file properly, say little publicly. I didn't tell her that week. Instead, I reviewed every document, every joint account, every shared asset. I made copies legally, transparently, and then I did something that felt strangely peaceful. I drafted a written summary of our relationship timeline. Not grievances, no complaints, just facts, dates, major events, counseling offers declined, financial agreements. It read like a report, because that's what this had become. On Friday afternoon, I signed the paperwork initiating separation. My hand didn't shake. There was no surge of anger, no dramatic final thought, just clarity. Once filed, the process would move forward regardless of emotion. That evening, I sat across from her in the living room, the same room where the accusation had been spoken. "I've started legal separation proceedings," I said evenly. Her face changed instantly, not fear, not sadness. Shock. "You're serious?" "Yes. You're just leaving." "I'm choosing structure." The words felt precise, because that's what it was. Not escape, not retaliation. Structure. She didn't know yet what I had preserved. She didn't know how carefully I had prepared. But she understood one thing immediately. The quiet man she believed she could narrate indefinitely had just made a decision she couldn't reverse with a story. And once you choose the irreversible option, everything else begins to unfold on its own timeline. There was no courtroom yet, but the path toward one had quietly begun. After I filed for legal separation, I didn't announce it publicly. There was no social media post. No defensive explanation was sent to mutual friends. No attempt to control the story before it moved. I followed the solicitor's advice: precisely document, disclose formally, and remain measured. The paperwork was served on a Wednesday afternoon. She called me immediately. "You blindsided me." Her voice wasn't furious. It was destabilized. "I told you I was choosing structure." I replied, "This is extreme." "No," I said calmly, "this is clear." And then I stopped speaking. That was the pattern now. Say only what is necessary. No elaboration that can be reshaped later. No emotional overflow. Over the next few weeks, practical shifts began. We separated finances formally. I transferred my portion of savings into an individual account, leaving detailed transaction records. I continued paying my agreed share of household expenses until a temporary arrangement was finalized. Everything traceable, everything professional. She began telling people. I could sense it in the subtle changes: messages from friends that felt carefully neutral, invitations that slowed, conversations that opened with cautious warmth. No one accused me directly, but something was moving. One evening, a mutual friend asked if I was doing okay emotionally. The phrasing was delicate, but loaded. "I'm steady," I said, and that was the truth. Behind the scenes, my solicitor requested disclosure statements. That's when the first formal mention appeared in writing. She alleged emotional control and psychological intimidation. There it was. On paper, not a social exaggeration, not a dinner party joke, a legal claim. I didn't feel anger when I read it. I felt confirmation. The narrative had crossed the threshold. Now it mattered. My solicitor asked, "Do you contest these characterizations?" "Yes," I said, "with documentation. We didn't submit everything at once." That would have looked retaliatory. Instead, we responded methodically. Financial transparency first, communication records second. Then, when necessary, context. I authorized the existence of audio logs, not as an accusation, but as corroboration of tone and content during disputes referenced in her statement. The solicitor listened to several recordings privately. He paused after one, a heated exchange where she accused me of isolating her. My response, steady and quiet, was asking if she would like to schedule dinner with her friends that weekend. He removed his headphones slowly. "This is very composed," he said. "Yes," I replied. He nodded once. "We'll proceed carefully." That was the strategy. Not to ambush, not to humiliate, to proceed carefully. At home, the atmosphere grew brittle. She oscillated between anger and disbelief. "You're making this worse," she said one night. "I'm formalizing it." I answered. The distinction mattered to me. Formalization removes interpretation. It moves disputes from emotion to evidence. And once proceedings advanced, mediation was scheduled. That's when I understood the next phase was inevitable. Because if allegations of abuse remain attached to a legal case, they don't simply float there. They are examined. And examination means context. Context means playback. The courtroom still hadn't entered our daily reality, but it was no longer abstract. Each step forward tightened the focus. I wasn't moving loudly. I wasn't retaliating socially, but I was positioning facts where they would matter most. She thought I had chosen distance. In reality, I had chosen documentation. And documentation, when presented calmly, speaks in a voice that doesn't need to shout. The consequences were beginning to form. She just didn't realize yet how much the story would change once it was required to stand under formal light. Consequences rarely arrive with sirens. They arrive in subtle absences. After the paperwork advanced and mediation dates were set, I began noticing small shifts around her not explosive reactions, but destabilization. Friends who once echoed her frustrations now asked more neutral questions. What exactly happened? Was it really that bad? When allegations move from private conversation to legal documentation, people instinctively become cautious. No one wants to stand firmly on a story that might collapse under scrutiny. She started growing irritated at that hesitation. "They're acting like I'm exaggerating," she said one night. I didn't respond, because I wasn't trying to win socially. I was waiting for the process. At mediation, the first formal discussion of her claims took place. She described feeling controlled, intimidated, and silenced. The mediator listened carefully, then turned to me. "How do you respond to these characterizations?" "I disagree," I said evenly. "And I have contextual records of the disputes referenced." The word records changes a room. It's clinical, cold, structured. Her posture shifted slightly. Not fear awareness. After mediation, she confronted me privately. "You've been building something behind my back." "No," I replied. "I've been preserving context." That distinction unsettled her more than denial would have. Over the following weeks, her tone softened intermittently. She suggested we handle this quietly, that we avoid dragging unnecessary details into it. But the details were no longer optional, because once a claim of emotional abuse appears in legal filings, it doesn't disappear casually. It must be addressed or withdrawn. And she didn't withdraw it. That's when the real consequence began to surface, not for me, but for her narrative. My solicitor formally requested clarification of specific incidents cited in her statement. Dates, descriptions, evidence. Specificity exposes exaggeration. She struggled to provide clear timelines. The descriptions remained abstract. Pattern of behavior, atmosphere of control, psychological pressure. Those phrases carry emotional weight, but under procedural review, they require anchors. Meanwhile, my composure remained unchanged. I continued working, continued paying my agreed obligations, continued interacting with her politely, but minimally. The emotional volatility she had once described in me was nowhere to be found. Friends began noticing. One mutual acquaintance told me quietly, "You don't seem like what I was expecting." I didn't ask what they were expecting. I already knew. The deeper consequence, though, wasn't social. It was internal. She began to realize that the narrative she had constructed so fluidly in private spaces was now being measured in a formal one. And formal spaces don't react to tone. They react to proof. One evening, she said something that revealed the shift completely. "You're taking this too far." I looked at her calmly. "I didn't file the allegation." I said. Silence followed. Because that was the pivot point. I hadn't escalated. I hadn't counterattacked. I hadn't smeared her socially. I had simply responded structurally. And structure is unforgiving to exaggeration. The consequences were no longer theoretical. They were procedural. Step by step. The story was being asked to stand on its own legs. And if it couldn't, it would fall quietly. Not because I shouted it down, but because I let it be examined. The courtroom was closer now. Not dramatic. Not theatrical. Just inevitable. And once truth is placed in a room where playback is possible, it doesn't need emotion to defend it. It only needs to be heard. The shift from mediation to the courtroom wasn't explosive. It was procedural. Her legal team maintained the allegation of emotional abuse. Not aggressively. Not with dramatic affidavits. But it remained present, a shadow attached to the proceedings. And once something like that is attached formally, it has to be evaluated. There was one final opportunity for withdrawal. A quiet amendment. A reframing. She didn't take it. I don't think she believed it would go as far as it did. I think she assumed the word itself would pressure me into negotiation, that I would concede financially or emotionally to avoid public examination. But I had already chosen structure over fear, so the hearing was scheduled. Family court isn't cinematic. It's fluorescent lighting, neutral walls, controlled voices. There are no dramatic gasps, no pounding gavels, just documentation. Her statement was read into the record in a controlled tone, with measured phrasing. Words like intimidation, psychological control, and walking on eggshells. I listened without interruption. Then my solicitor requested permission to introduce contextual audio evidence tied directly to specific incidents referenced in her statement. There was a pause, not dramatic, procedural. Permission granted. I remember the exact sensation in that moment. Not triumph, not adrenaline. Stillness. Because this was the line between narrative and record. The first clip played. It was the argument about finances she had described as threatening. In the recording, her voice was raised. Mine was calm. I asked if we could review numbers together. I suggested postponing a discretionary expense. I said, clearly, I'm not angry. I just want clarity. No raised voice, no insult, no coercion. The room remained quiet. The second clip played the conversation she had described as isolating her from friends. In it, I asked if she wanted to host dinner that weekend. She declined. I responded, "That's fine. Let me know if you change your mind. No restriction, no pressure." Clip after clip followed the same pattern. Context, full sentences, tone intact. And then something subtle happened. Her posture changed. Not collapse, not panic, but recognition. The words she had used in filings were now standing next to audio reality. And they didn't align. The courtroom heard the truth straight from our living room. Not my interpretation of it, not my defense of it. The truth. There was no dramatic confrontation, no heated exchange between us. Just the quiet weight of playback. Her counsel requested a brief recess. When proceedings resumed, the language in her claim shifted. Misinterpretation, emotional incompatibility, communication breakdown. Abuse was no longer emphasized. But it was too late. Because once something is examined publicly and shown to lack foundation, it doesn't disappear quietly. It leaves a record. The judge's remarks were restrained, but clear allegations require substantiation. Tone matters. Context matters. The final determinations focused on asset division and separation terms. The abuse claim did not carry weight in the outcome. Not because I argued loudly, but because I didn't need to. Afterward, in the corridor outside the courtroom, she looked at me differently. Not angry, not vengeful, but aware. "You recorded everything," she said quietly. "I preserved context." I replied. She didn't respond, because in that moment, we both understood something irreversible. A narrative can feel powerful in private, but under formal light it either stands or it doesn't. And once the truth has been played in full, There's no editing it back into a different story. It was too late to fix it. Not the marriage. The record. The final conversation didn't happen in the courtroom. It happened a week later, in the same living room where everything had started. The grey sofa, the muted walls, the quiet hum of the boiler. Most of her things were already packed. The house felt hollow, like sound carried differently inside it. She stood near the window. I remained by the dining table. The physical distance between us mirrored something that had been growing for months. There was no anger in the room, just clarity. I didn't think it would go like that, she said finally. I know, I replied. She crossed her arms, not defensive, just cold. You made me look like I lied. I considered the phrasing carefully. I didn't make you look like anything. I said, I let the full conversations be heard. That was the difference. I hadn't attacked her character. I hadn't introduced counter-accusations. I hadn't tried to dissect her motives in front of strangers. I had simply allowed context to exist where it mattered. She exhaled slowly. You could have told me you were recording. And then what I asked calmly, would that have changed how we spoke? Silence answered for her. Because that was the uncomfortable truth. The recordings hadn't altered my tone. They hadn't forced composure. They hadn't manufactured calmness. They had only captured what was already there. She walked toward the sofa and sat down. For a moment, she looked smaller. Not defeated, just confronted by reality. I felt overwhelmed, she said quietly. You always seemed so steady. It made me feel chaotic. That was the closest she had come to honesty. Not abuse, not control. Contrast, my steadiness against her volatility. I never wanted you to feel small. I said, but I also won't accept being labeled something I'm not. No raised voice, no emotional surge, just boundary. She nodded once, eyes fixed on the floor. I thought if I used stronger language, she admitted, you'd finally react. There it was. The expectation of an explosion. The belief that pressure would force heat. But heat never came. I reacted, I said gently. Just not the way you expected. That line hung in the air between us. Because that was the quiet reversal. She had tried to provoke emotion. I responded with structure. She had used narrative. I responded with a record. Neither of us shouted. Neither of us insulted. And in that stillness, the imbalance became visible. She stood to leave, pausing at the doorway. Do you hate me? No, I answered honestly. I just don't trust the version of me you were willing to present. That was the confrontation. Not explosive. Not theatrical. Final. When the door closed behind her, the house felt different, not lighter, not heavier. Just quiet in a way that wasn't tense anymore. I sat down on the sofa and listened to the silence. For the first time in months, it wasn't being interpreted by anyone else. It was just silence. Neutral. Honest. And I understood something clearly. You don't have to raise your voice to defend yourself. Sometimes, the most powerful confrontation is simply refusing to let your character be rewritten. Calmly. Completely. Without heat. It's been a year since the hearing. The house is different now. I kept it refinanced, repainted, rearranged. The grey sofa is gone. The walls are warmer. There's less echo. Silence lives here differently now. Not as tension. Not as anticipation. Just space. People sometimes expect a transformation story at this point. A dramatic reinvention. A louder version of me stepping into rooms with new authority. But that's not what happened. I'm still steady. Still measured. Still quiet in conversation. The difference isn't in volume, it's certain. There's a particular kind of damage that comes from being labelled something you're not, especially something serious. It lingers. Even after the correction. Even after evidence. For months after the courtroom, I would replay small interactions in my head, wondering if I sounded too firm, too direct, too distant. That reflex takes time to unwind. But slowly, something shifted. I stopped scanning myself through someone else's interpretation. I stopped softening instinctively to avoid imaginary accusations. I realized that composure doesn't need an apology. Calm doesn't require explanation. And firmness, when rooted in respect, is not cruelty. At work, colleagues noticed a subtle change. Not louder, just clearer. When I disagree now, I don't cushion it unnecessarily. I say, I don't agree with that conclusion, and leave it there. No overclarification. Because I've learned something essential. If someone is determined to misinterpret you, over-explaining won't stop them. Consistency will. Socially, some friendships faded, others strengthened. The ones who quietly waited for evidence before forming judgment, those are the ones still here. I don't resent the others. Fear makes people cautious. Allegations make people step back. That's human. But I no longer chase perception. I let behavior speak. Sometimes I think about that phrase she used. You don't even have to raise your voice. She meant it as something ominous. Now I understand it differently. True strength rarely shouts. It doesn't need to. It prepares. It documents. It waits. Not to destroy, but to stand steady when tested. I don't hate her. I don't replay the recordings anymore. They're archived, untouched, where they belong. Not trophies, not weapons. Just records of a time when truth needed preservation. If anything, the experience refined my moral code. Truth over ego, evidence over emotion, dignity over spectacle. I didn't win anything in that courtroom. There was no applause, no public vindication tour. What I gained was quieter. I gained the unshakable knowledge that when my character was examined formally, it held. And that kind of certainty changes how you move through the world. I no longer fear being misunderstood, because if misunderstanding happens again, I know exactly how to respond. Not loudly, not angrily, but clearly. And clarity, when supported by fact, is stronger than any accusation spoken in frustration. I'm still Leon Griffin, just no longer defined by someone else's version of me. When people hear a story like this, they often search for a villain. They want a clean ending, a clear moral hierarchy. Someone is entirely wrong. Someone is entirely right. But real life rarely arranges itself that neatly. This wasn't a story about defeating someone. It was a story about protecting reality when perception started drifting. There's a difference. I didn't expose her to humiliate her. I didn't archive conversations to trap her. I didn't wait silently so I could strike later. I waited because I needed to be sure of myself first. And once I was certain, once I knew that what was being said about me didn't align with what was actually happening, I chose structure over emotion. That's the part most people miss. When she told everyone I was abusive, I didn't chase the rumor. I didn't beg people to believe me. I didn't shout my innocence into rooms already leaning toward doubt. I preserved context. And when the moment came, the courtroom heard the truth straight from our living room. Not edited, not summarized, not filtered through hurt feelings. Just the truth. There's a quiet lesson in that. If your character is ever questioned, your first instinct might be to defend yourself loudly, to argue, to demand validation. But noise doesn't equal credibility. Consistency does. Documentation does. Calm does. This story isn't encouraging paranoia. It isn't suggesting you record every interaction or anticipate betrayal at every turn. It's about something simpler. Know who you are. Live consistently enough that your reality can withstand scrutiny. And if you ever find yourself misrepresented, respond with clarity, not chaos. Some narratives collapse under light. Others strengthen. The only way to know which one you're living in is to let it be examined fully. So I'll leave you with this. If someone told the world a version of you that wasn't true, would your consistency be strong enough to let the truth speak for itself? I'd really like to hear your thoughts in the comments.